We in a London, say where you from. We tell her England, now where you gone. We in a London, cause say me done. And me heart bright up on the sugar. Say we are started with the foundation. China say building up a revolution. I say we going on in a bada dinner in a Kingston. I say me heart bright up on the sugar. And we are started with the foundation. China say building up a revolution. I say we go on them a bada dinner in a Kingston. Hello lovely people, welcome back to Fixing Rusty Stuff, where if it ain't broken, I'll fix it till it is. I am not professing to have any knowledge, qualifications, skills or experience in anything I do in these videos, and they should be taken purely for entertainment purposes. It all suddenly got very exciting when the materials finally came to complete the base, along with 62 4x2s, 14 6x2s, 13 sheets of ply and 400 wood screws. I have no idea how many wood screws a shed like this devours, but I've already bought another 400, so let's call it at least 8. My carpenter mate, let's call him Chippy, he was surprised I used screws and he said nails are better because they bend and don't snap. But screws were cheaper, and with the added benefit of being easier to remove during my inevitable numerous mistakes, they became the fixing of choice. Speaking of mistakes, Chippy also told me that I shouldn't have laid out the ply with all the corners meeting at one point, as you can see they do in these two places. He never explained why, and as I was a little too far gone past the point of no return, I left it as it is. I started the stud work by building a back wall first to a height of approximately 1.9 metres using a 400mm spacing centre to centre. Learning from my building a shed floor video, link in the description of course, I made sure that the external ply sheets would land slap bang in the middle of a wall stud. The back wall went up first and then the side. Normally you'd frame the front and the back first and build the sides up and sandwich them in between. However, as you cannot pry the hair of a gnat's bollocks between the side of my shed and my neighbour's fence, and getting an impact driver in between is about as likely as Rishi Sunak doing an honest day's work, I built the side next and fixed it into position with the outer layer of ply already attached. I then built the front and hoisted it up into place before building the last remaining side next to the path. You may be able to notice that the front of the shed is now reduced in height. This is because, after realising how ridiculously high 2.5 metres is, and fearing the remainders of my garden may be left in a permanent state of shade, I changed the roof pitch from 2 in 12 to 1 in 12. That's 9.46 to 4.76 degrees for those who prefer a unit at plane angle. It brought the front of the cave to a more reasonable height, which I'm sure my future garden plants will be grateful for. But fixing, why 2.5 metres I hear you ask in perplexion? Well, the word on the planning regulation grapevine is that if your shed is within 2 metres of your property line, the structure must be no higher than 2.5 metres from ground level. Unless you want to apply for planning permission, of course. Here you can see me checking the structure for stability. Oh dear, it's got more wobble than a plate of jelly on a trampoline. It will of course need evenly distributed noggins to keep it firm and locked in place, but that's for another day. I got to cutting some roof joists to support the loosely strewn plywood and tarpaulin to prevent everything getting soaked in a non-existent English summer overnight. This was a temporary roofing solution just to ensure it remained covered. The extra long roof joist sticking out is what I call my hanging post, which is where I'll end up if the bill gets a bit too stressful. Only kidding, it was getting late so I retired the chop saw for the day as I didn't want my neighbours banging on my door complaining about building site noise at obscene hours. I got the 4 walls up in one day and would have put in all the noggins first, but I was so worried about the rain sabotaging me that getting the boards and tarpaulin up took priority. Just for the record, I would definitely recommend getting the wall noggins in before starting the roof. As you can tell, I have a proclivity for doing the right things the wrong way. The walls had a double top plate overlapping where they joined at the corners. This large gap you can see is not because I had too much rum and forgot to install the wall studs. It's for a large circular window that I'm going to bodge together using an old glass tabletop. which I'm sure will leak constantly. Now you can see that I've got all the roof joists up and into position, but before I go into that, check out how perfectly straight these walls are. Upon waking up and inspecting the previous day's handiwork, I noticed that somewhere in the melee I seem to have allowed the walls to creep just a little bit too far out of plumb. I rectified this by removing the top plate and a few carefully selected screws, used a couple of 4x2s to wedge it into a life of straightness, and screwed everything back together standing true. And now the proof that the wall is straighter than a ruler in an architect's pencil case. Onto the roof joists. This cut is what is known in the trade as a swan's beak. Stop shouting at the screen, I was kidding. It's called a bird's mouth. This is where you cut an angled wedge out of a roof joist to allow it to sit nicely on the wall's top plate. Now, it has to be said that making these cuts was not my finest hour, and initially, as you can tell from the numerous gaps and splintered wood, I did find them a little tricky. Well, I never professed to be a carpenter, I just said that I got wood. Bloody hell, that was hectic. Now, not that I'm suggesting you should copy this method, but to me it appears the easiest way to cut a bird's mouth is by using a carpenter's speed square. Sit the square on a joist and mark a line across the timber where you want the edge of the top plate to sit. Then pivot the square on that mark down to the pitch number you require as indicated on the square. Mark another line across the timber. My pitch is 1 in 12, so I'll pivot down to the 1 and mark a line at that angle. This is the cut that will sit on the side of the top plate. Now you have to decide how deep you want the bird's mouth. This will be a perpendicular cut to the line I just drew, and as a general rule of thumb, it should be no more than a third of the total depth of the timber. So for a 6x2, that's 2 inches. I just marked along this line here for convenience, as that worked out to be about 1 inch. Here I'm marking out the piece that you can cut out, but speed was of the essence for me, so I just cut it out with one long cut and one short one. I fixed the roof joist to the top plate by screwing a diagonal screw in each side. My old mate Chippy assured me that this would be more stable than a house for a horse, but I think I'll also install some sort of brackets to ensure that the English winter don't take my roof away in a particularly vigorous gust to fulfil a destiny of being scrapwood. I did consider putting another screw diagonally up through the front, but I just wasn't convinced this would do much more than tear the shit out of the wood. Once I banged all the roof joists in, I braced up nicely with some noggins, and Bob's your uncle, Fanny's your dad's sister, you've got a roof. Time for a couple of beautiful still images of my roof under a very rare cloudless English sky. Well, almost cloudless. Let's take a look at what happens if you throw a few sheets of ply and wallop a few well placed screws on top of the joists. I must almost have an IP01 rating by now, or as I like to call it, level 2 on the hospitable environment scale. I say almost because in not wanting to break theme and to maintain a little continuity in the series, I ran out of screws, hence this missing piece of ply on the corner. Unlike 2.4 metre sheets of ply, wood screws are stocked at Screwfix, so behold the roof with ply and waterproof membrane installed in all its wondrous glory. I overlapped the membrane at the marked point and completely ignored the instructions, which advised securing it using extra large head clout nails of copper, aluminium alloy or galvanised steel, and of course used a heavy duty stapler to bodge it into place. I feel we're creeping up the scale here, ladies and gents. We must at least have achieved an IP rating of 02 by now. Or should I say, level 4 on our personalised and obviously far more accurate scale. You are now looking at what is essentially the back fascia, which is a 6x2 end plate screwed into the butt of the roof joists. I did the same on the front. The brackets screwed onto the shed in the top right and left hand side of the front doorway were holding up the sink in my old bathroom. I expect it was installed in the 1960s. I'll attempt to reuse them in a later episode, but for now they were of great assistance in helping me hold up that 6x2 fascia and screwing it into place. The only part of this build I've actually had any human assistance with so far was pouring the concrete with my cousin back in episode 1, linking the... well, you get the picture. Now, it has to be said that I have a very compulsive and irrational phobia of actually finishing a job, so I made sure to start plying the outside before actually completing the installation of all the wall noggins, as evidenced here. For the front window, I doubled up on the 4x2s above and below. This footage, I would suggest, is somewhat of a landmark VT, because as you can tell it is raining cats and canines. The external ply installation is almost completely finished, and as we enter the fabled cave of men, the rain becomes but a distant memory as dryness has been achieved. Well, dry enough to keep things dry that you don't want to get wet. So, by my estimate, we are approximately IP13 rated. Or, on the more important measure, the wetness scale, we are at a 7, ladies and gentlemen. The ply is mostly on and I've started to cut out the opening for the first window. A little birdie told me that I should seal between the sheets of ply, so I very crudely applied some leftover bathroom sealant and it seemed to do the job. I'm sure I'll get a barrage of comments about my terrible splintered patchwork walls. Feel free to tell me how bad they are in the comments. After borrowing a jigsaw from my burly cousin, and a little deliberation, I also cut a hole for the glass tabletop window bodge which I have planned. Well, I'll say planned, I actually have no idea how I'm going to make it work yet, so that's a bit of an overstatement. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of the second episode. In the next video I'll be installing the waterproof membrane and cladding, and maybe even taking a little look at one of those 2 windows. If you found that mildly entertaining, hammer the like button, subscribe to the channel, share it with your dad, and stay tuned for the next instalment of Fixed in Rusty Stuff.